For 8 long years, Caleb Whitlock lived in silence, his only companions the wind that swept across the Texas plains and the 2 wooden crosses on the hill behind his ranch. He spoke to no one save for the occasional word to his horses, or the muttered prayers he whispered to Eliz and Clara, his wife and daughter, whose lives had been stolen in one bloody morning he couldn't forget. The man he used to be full of laughter and dreams was buried alongside them. All that remained was a shadow with calloused hands and weary eyes, a hermit who kept the world at bay with fences, locks, and an iron will. His neighbors in town, those few who remembered his name, spoke of him in hushed tones. Some said he'd gone mad after the war. Others claimed he'd killed men and couldn't risk being seen. But Tobias didn't care what they said. The truth was simpler and far sadder. The world had taken everything from him, and he wanted nothing to do with it ever again. Each day he rose with the sun tending to his land like a man tending to his own grave. He mended fences, patched roofs, and planted small crops that never seemed to thrive in the hard Texas soil. At night, he sat by the fireplace with his dog at his feet, the bridle in his hands needing repair for the 100th time, not because the leather was worn, but because keeping busy kept the memories at bay. The Army had taken his wife and daughter 8 years ago. They'd come looking for hostile Apache in the area, but all they found that morning was a peaceful family preparing breakfast. A misunderstanding, they called it later. But there was no misunderstanding in the way Tobias had buried 2 small bodies under a sky choked with gun smoke. After that day, he locked his doors and swore never to let anyone in again. Not strangers, not friends, not even God. So when the storm hit that night, Tobias expected it to pass like every other, hammering rain against the shutters, the wind howling through the cracks in his roof. He didn't expect the pounding on his door, desperate and insistent. He didn't expect voices, women's voices, calling out in Apache, a language he hadn't heard since that morning 8 years ago. And he didn't expect the moment of hesitation that froze him in place, leather bridle still in his hands. The knocking came again, harder now. Not the knock of a neighbor, but the pounding of souls who had nowhere else to go. Tobias's hand hovered over the rifle above his mantle. Old instincts told him to keep the door shut to stay safe. But something in those voices, carried on the wind and rain, spoke of desperation, of life and death. And in that moment, Tobias realized that the world he had shut out for so long was coming back, whether he wanted it to or not. The storm came down hard that night, pounding the plains of West Texas with sheets of rain, and wind strong enough to rattle the shutters on Caleb Whitlock's cabin. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the endless miles of prairie grass, and the thunder rolled so loud it made the old wooden walls tremble. Most folks with any sense were safe inside, warm and dry, waiting for the storm to pass. But not everyone had that luxury. Tobias sat in his chair by the fire, the bridle in his hands needing repair, though he'd already mended it 3 times before. It wasn't the leather that needed work. It was his restless mind. He'd learned over the years that keeping his hands busy was the only way to keep the ghosts at bay. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, but he didn't flinch. After 8 years alone, you stopped being afraid of storms. Then came the knock. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It was desperate, frantic, the sound of knuckles pounding against old oak with all the strength they had left. Tobias froze, his hands tightening on the bridle. Nobody came out to his ranch anymore. Not neighbors, not travelers. Not even the occasional drifter. Folks knew Caleb Whitlock wanted to be left alone. The knock came again, louder this time, and he thought he heard voices. Women's voices, muffled by the storm but unmistakable in their urgency. He stood slowly, his knees cracking from years of hard living. His hand brushed against the Winchester rifle mounted above the mantel. Old instincts told him to be cautious. The last time strangers came knocking in the night, he'd buried everyone he loved the next morning. Through the thick wooden door, he caught fragments of words. Not English, but Apache. The sound made his blood run cold. The Army had taught him to fear that language, though he'd learned enough to understand simple phrases. Please. Shelter. Baby. Dying. Tobias pressed his palm to the door, feeling the vibrations of the storm and the voices outside. He remembered Sarah's voice, soft and warm, saying, "Kindness is what makes us human, Tob. Don't ever lose that." But Eliza was gone now, buried beneath the Texas dirt. And kindness hadn't saved her. "Go away," he muttered, though. Even as he said it, he knew they couldn't hear him over the storm. Then came another voice, closer this time. A woman speaking English, her accent thick but her words clear. "We know you're there. Please, we have children. Soldiers are coming. If you don't help us, we will die. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die too." Tobias's jaw clenched. 8 years behind these walls, 8 years of peace bought with isolation, and now the outside world was pounding on his door. His hand hovered over the iron bar that locked it shut. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it bolted, but then he thought of the soldiers she'd mentioned. He'd known men like that in his time, men who wore uniforms but left their humanity behind when they rode into Apache villages. Men who burned homes, killed families, and silenced survivors. He lifted the bar. The door groaned as it swung open, letting in a rush of cold, wet air and a sight that hit him like a kick to the gut. 10 women stood on his porch, huddled together, their dresses soaked and clinging to their thin frames. Mud streaked their faces and hands. Some bore fresh wounds, cuts, and bruises that spoke of recent violence. The youngest, no more than 16, clutched a bundle wrapped in a torn blanket. The bundle moved weakly, and Tobias realized with a start it was a baby. The woman who'd spoken stepped forward. She was taller than the others, her posture straight despite the exhaustion in her face. Blood trickled from a cut above her eye, and her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her dark eyes locked onto his without flinching. "I am Nayeli," she said carefully. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days. The soldiers hunting us are close." Tobias opened his mouth, then closed it again. Questions crowded his mind: where they'd come from, why they were alone, why they had come here. But then he looked at the baby's pale lips and heard the tiny ragged breaths. Some things mattered more than answers. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping back. The women moved quickly, filing past him into the cabin like shadows. The scent of rain, mud, and fear filled the small room. Tobias felt his sanctuary shrinking around them. For 8 years, this place had been his fortress against the world. Now it felt like the front line of a coming war. As Nayeli entered last, she paused beside him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The soldiers will not stop until we are dead. Maybe an hour, maybe less. If they find us here, they will kill you too." Tobias closed the door and slid the iron bar back into place, knowing it wouldn't matter. His life of solitude had ended the moment he'd opened that door, and somewhere out in the storm, death was riding toward them. The storm had started to ease, but the sound of hooves sloshing through the mud was growing louder. Somewhere beyond the tree line, they were coming, soldiers hardened by war and emboldened by the belief that no one could stop them. Caleb Whitlock stared at the iron bar he'd just lowered across his door. For 8 years, he'd lived in solitude, letting no one in and asking nothing from the world. But now, 10 Apache women and a tiny gasping baby huddled inside his cabin, their wide, terrified eyes fixed on him as though he were their last hope. Their leader, Nayeli, stood apart from the others. She'd introduced herself in careful English. When he opened the door, her voice calmed despite the storm and the fear in her people's faces. "We have been running for 3 days," she had said. "The soldiers hunting us will not stop until we are all dead." Now she met his gaze steadily, even as her younger sisters tended wounds and murmured to each other in Apache near the fire. "If you help us, you put yourself in danger," she said softly. "When they come, they will not spare you." Tobias's jaw tightened. "If I turn you away, what happens? They will find us, kill us all, and leave our bodies at your door as a warning. And then they will kill you too, to silence any witness." It wasn't an empty threat. Tobias had seen what these soldiers could do. During his years in the army and later as a railroad foreman on the frontier, he'd watched peacekeeping missions turn into massacres. He'd known men like Captain Hartwell, uniformed predators who wore honor like a mask. For a moment, Tobias considered telling them to hide in the cellar beneath his kitchen. Its stone walls and hidden entrance had kept his few valuables safe for years. But Nayeli shook her head as if reading his mind. "If they search and find us, you die with us," she said. "If they find an empty house with signs that people were here, they may let you live. We will not make you an enemy of the United States Army." Tobias almost laughed. 8 years too late for that. Outside, the wind shifted. Between gusts, Tobias heard men's voices, orders barked, low horses snorting, and the cold metal clinking as rifles were checked and readied. "They'll be here soon," Nayeli murmured. Tobias turned toward the rifle above his mantle. His fingers brushed the worn stock as Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Kindness, Tob. Don't let the world take it from you." Kindness. Was that what this was? Or was it just one more foolish decision to add to a long list of regrets? He grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. Loaded. Ready. "There's a dam above this ranch," Tobias said, thinking aloud. "I built it years ago to hold back the spring floods. If I blow it, the valley will fill with water fast, wash them all out." Nayeli's expression didn't change. "And kill every horse, every soldier, and any child they've brought with them." "Soldiers don't bring children," Tobias muttered. "You're sure?" A silence settled over the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Tobias had seen too much of the world to answer. Nayeli placed a hand on his arm, firm and unflinching. "You are not like them. You know there is a better way." He looked at her and realized she wasn't pleading. She was challenging him. Outside, a voice called out through the storm, "Rancher, open this door, or we burn your house to the ground and drag you out." Tobias felt the rage rise in his chest. Rage at Morrison and his men. rage at himself for believing he could shut out the world forever, and beneath it all a quiet, steady determination. "No," he said, his voice low but certain. "We're not running. We fight here." Nayeli's lips curved in the faintest smile. The women moved with practiced efficiency, their torn dresses concealing knives, small hatchets, and even a few pistols. They weren't just refugees, they were warriors. Tobias set bear traps in the tall grass outside the windows and scattered caltrops in the mud near the barn. He unlatched the back door, creating an ambush point for the women who would hold the rear line. Nayeli stood by the front door, blade in hand, her face calm as the eye of a storm. "They think we're prey," she said. "Tonight they learn we are the hunters." The first soldier kicked open the door, rifle raised, expecting cowering women and a frightened rancher. Instead, Tobias's Winchester barked once, and the man crumpled in the doorway. The fight that followed was short and brutal. Tobias and the Apache women fought not for glory but for survival. Morrison's men, caught off guard, fell quickly. But when the shooting stopped, a new sound carried on the wind, more hooves, more voices. Reinforcements. Nayeli appeared at Tobias's side, her face streaked with sweat and soot. "Colonel Whitmore has come," she said grimly. "And he has brought his son." Tobias wiped the rain from his eyes and gripped his rifle tighter. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a choice that would define the rest of his life. That night, Caleb Whitlock chose to stand. Not as a soldier, not as a hermit, but as a man who remembered what it meant to be human. The cabin was no longer quiet. For 8 years, Caleb Whitlock had lived in silence, his only companions, the wind and the creak of old wood. But now his home felt alive with movement. 10 Apache women worked with swift, practiced efficiency, their torn dresses and muddied braids concealing weapons they'd hidden on their bodies. Knives glinted as they were sharpened. A small pistol emerged from the folds of an older woman's shawl, its barrel cleaned with steady hands. Tobias watched from near the fireplace, his rifle cradled in his arms. He'd let them in thinking they were helpless refugees, but now he understood these women weren't here by accident. Nayeli, their leader, stood tall in the dim light. Her voice was low but commanding as she spoke in Apache, giving instructions that the others followed without hesitation. One by one, they melted into the shadows of the cabin, positioning themselves like seasoned fighters preparing for an ambush. "You're not helpless," Tobias said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Nayeli glanced at him, her dark eyes steady. "We never were." It was not an apology nor a boast. It was a simple truth delivered with the weight of someone who'd been forced to fight for survival more times than she could count. Tobias moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. The storm outside had lessened, but the wind still carried the faint sound of horses in the distance. The soldiers were spreading out their boots, squelching in the mud, their voices low as they planned their assault. "They'll come from 3 sides," Tobias murmured more to himself than anyone else. "Standard military tactic. 2 groups to flank one through the front. They'll want to flush you out." Nayeli joined him at the window. "And you? Will you stand with us?" Tobias looked at her. For a moment, the old grief threatened to pull him under memories of Eliza and Clara, of blood on his hands and a house burning in the dawn light. But something in Nayeli's gaze steadied him. "I didn't open that door to watch you die," he said. "I'll fight." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, though her eyes stayed hard. "Good. They'll expect us to be weak. That will be their mistake." The 2 of them worked quickly, Tobias showing Nayeli the layout of the ranch. He pointed out choke points, blind corners, and places where the land dipped, spots he'd learned over years of tending cattle and building fences. "There's a dam up the hill," Tobias said, thinking aloud. "If we blow it, the water would flood the valley in minutes." Nayeli shook her head. "Too many would die, including any innocents they might have with them." "Innocents?" Tobias asked. "They've used women and children before to shield themselves," Nayeli said grimly. "We've seen it." Tobias cursed under his breath. He'd known men like Morrison, men who wore their uniforms like armor and their cruelty like a badge of honor. By the time the soldiers reached the outer fence, the cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a fortress. Tobias had set bear traps in the tall grass leading to the barn and strung tripwires across likely approach paths. The women had prepared barricades inside the house, using overturned tables and barrels of grain. Nayeli handed Tobias a small, polished mirror. "When you see the signal, take Morrison," she said. He nodded, tucking the mirror into his coat pocket. The first shout came from outside. "Rancher, open the door and we'll make it quick. Resist and we burn you out." Tobias felt the weight of the Winchester in his hands. "They really think they've got us cornered," he muttered. "They do," Nayeli said, "but they're not ready for what's coming." The assault began with a crash. Morrison kicked open the front door, rifle raised, expecting to find terrified women and a cowering rancher. Instead, he found Tobias calm and steady, his rifle already aimed. The shot rang out and Morrison's hat flew off as he stumbled back. The bullet had missed on purpose, just close enough to remind him he wasn't invincible. Before Morrison could recover, Nayeli's signal flashed from the mirror. The women erupted from their hiding places. Knives flashed, shots fired. The soldiers caught in the narrow entryway didn't stand a chance. Outside, chaos reigned. Traps snapped shut on unsuspecting boots. Horses screamed as caltrops bit into their hooves. 2 soldiers went down before they even reached the porch. But Tobias knew the fight wasn't over. From the tree line, more torches flickered to life. Reinforcements. At least 20 more riders, led by a man whose voice cut through the night like a blade. "This is Colonel Whitmore of the United States Army. You are surrounded." Nayeli appeared at Tobias's side, her face pale but determined. "They brought a full company," she whispered. "We can't win this fight." Tobias's mind raced. "Maybe not in a straight fight," he said. "But if we break their nerve..." Nayeli's eyes narrowed. How Tobias looked toward the barn. "We hit them where they least expected." Nayeli nodded slowly. "Then we make this count." Together, they moved toward the back door, ready to turn Tobias's little ranch into the last stand of 2 people who had already lost everything. That night, Caleb Whitlock and 10 Apache women reminded the world that courage isn't about surviving. It's about standing for what's right no matter the cost. The storm had broken, leaving the air heavy and thick, with the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. Steam rose from the mud as Caleb Whitlock crouched near the broken window of his cabin, his Winchester rifle steady in his hands. His breath came slow, and even but inside his chest burned with the familiar cold fire of survival. Around him, the room was alive with motion. The Apache women moved like shadows, their footsteps soundless on the wooden floor. Nayeli was near the doorway, her blade glinting faintly in the pale moonlight. The younger women tended to the wounded. One of their sisters had taken a bullet to the shoulder, her dress dark with blood. But there was no time for fear or mourning. Outside, voices rose over the sound of boots sloshing in the mud. "Lieutenant Morrison is dead," one soldier shouted. "They're in there. Surround the house." Tobias glanced at Nayeli. "They'll come from every side now. They'll burn us out if they can't shoot us out." Nayeli didn't flinch. "Then we fight until they're gone. Or we are." The first assault had been swift and brutal. Morrison and his men had stormed the cabin, rifles raised, expecting to find terrified women and a lone rancher begging for his life. Instead, they found a trap. Tobias's first shot had blown Morrison's hat clean off his head, sending the captain reeling backward into the mud. In that instant of confusion, Nayeli and her women struck like coiled snakes. Blades flashed. Shots rang out in the confined space. Screams echoed in the storm. When it was over, Morrison lay dead on the floor, eyes wide, with shock blood soaking into the rough wooden planks. His men were scattered around the property, some dead, others groaning in the mud. But their victory was short-lived. From the tree line came the unmistakable sound of hooves, dozens of them. Torches flickered in the distance, their glow reflected in the shallow pools of rainwater across the yard. Nayeli's face was pale but set in grim determination. "Colonel Whitmore has come," she murmured. "And he's brought his army." Tobias's jaw tightened. He'd heard of Bradley, an officer with a reputation for ruthlessness, a man who'd made a career out of pacifying Apache villages. "How many?" Tobias asked. "Too many," Nayeli replied. 30, maybe 40. The cold certainty settled in Tobias's gut. There was no winning this fight, not head-on. A voice boomed across the yard. "This is Colonel Whitmore of the United States Army. You are surrounded. Surrender now, and you may yet live." Tobias risked a glance through the crack in the shutters. Soldiers fanned out across his property, rifles glinting in the torchlight. In the center of the formation, a young man in a lieutenant's uniform stood close to Bradley, his son, no doubt barely more than a boy. "They'll kill us all if we give up," Tobias said quietly. Nayeli nodded. "We know." Tobias's mind raced. The dam. The dynamite. One well-placed charge and he could flood the valley, wiping out the soldiers in minutes. But then he remembered the baby's cries from earlier. "They brought a child," Tobias whispered. Nayeli's eyes hardened. "It could be a trick." "No," Tobias said. "I heard it. A real baby." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick as the storm clouds that still loomed overhead. "If we blow the dam, that child dies," Tobias said. "And we're no better than them." Nayeli's hand tightened on her knife. "Then what do you suggest?" Tobias turned toward the others. "We make them think we're trapped. We give them a reason to get cocky. When they rush in, we split them, cut them off from their leader." Nayeli tilted her head. "And Bradley?" "We take his son," Tobias said. "Bradley's army isn't fighting for gold or glory. They're fighting because he commands them. You hold his boy's life in your hands and you hold his power." The plan was dangerous, desperate, but it was all they had. Minutes later, the sound of gunfire erupted from the front of the cabin. Nayeli and half her women made as much noise as possible, shouting, firing shots, overturning furniture. Outside, Bradley's voice roared again. Advance flushed them out. As soldiers surged toward the cabin, Tobias slipped through the shadows at the rear of the house with the remaining women. The reserve force left to guard the horses and supplies never saw them coming. Tobias moved like the man he used to be before grief turned him into a hermit, calm, efficient, deadly. The first soldier went down without a sound, the second with a muffled cry. By the time the others realized what was happening, Tobias had his rifle leveled at the lieutenant, the colonel's son. "Don't move," Tobias said coldly. The young man froze, terror written across his boyish face. When Tobias returned to the cabin, the fighting at the front had stopped. 2 Apache women lay still in the mud, but the others had driven back the soldiers who'd charged. Naili's eyes flicked to the lieutenant Tobias, now held at gunpoint. "You took him alive," she said. "Bradley's men will hesitate with his boy in danger," Tobias replied. "That hesitation will save lives." Outside, the colonel's voice rang out again, this time strained, tinged with fear. "Release my son and we'll discuss terms," Naili called back, her voice sharp as her blade. "There are no terms. You burned our homes, slaughtered our people, and now you expect mercy number. Tonight you learn what mercy costs." For a moment all was still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Tobias looked at the boy, barely 19, shaking in fear. He thought of Sarah, of Clara, of the countless innocents caught in wars they never started. "There's another way," Tobias said quietly to Naili. His testimony, a colonel's son speaking the truth, could destroy Bradley and end this bloodshed. Naili's knife hovered near the boy's throat. Her eyes were unreadable. Finally, she lowered the blade. Outside, new voices carried across the plains, more riders, federal marshals drawn by reports of the violence. As dawn broke over the blood-soaked ranch, Colonel Whitmore was led away in chains. The Apache women, battered but alive, rode north toward safety. Tobias stood in the wreckage of his home, staring at the rising sun. For 8 years he had lived as though already dead. But on this night, with the world finally at peace around him, Caleb Whitlock had chosen life. Sometimes courage doesn't look like pulling a trigger. Sometimes it looks like putting down your gun and saving the innocent, even when the world calls you a fool for it. The first rays of dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the wreckage of Caleb Whitlock's ranch in muted shades of gold and gray. Smoke curled from the smoldering ruins of the barn. The main cabin, though still standing, bore deep scars, bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, and a front door that hung from one rusted hinge. Tobias stood barefoot in the mud, his rifle resting against his shoulder. His once pristine coat was ripped and blood-stained, not all of it his own. 8 years he had lived on this land in silence, burying himself in chores and memories. Now the quiet was back again, but it was different. Heavy. Broken. Behind him, the 10 Apache women gathered their wounded. Of the original group, 2 would never rise again, their lifeless forms wrapped in torn blankets. The others bore cuts, bruises, and burns, but were alive because they had refused to surrender to the men who hunted them. Naili moved among her people with calm authority, speaking in her native tongue as she organized them for departure. Her dark eyes swept across the wreckage before settling on Tobias. "You saved us," she said softly, "and you lost everything to do it." Tobias shook his head. "This place stopped being a home a long time ago. Now it's just wood and stone, easy to burn, easy to rebuild. But lives," he looked toward the smallest of the group, a teenage girl, cradling a baby in her arms. "Lives are harder to replace." Hours earlier, Tobias had faced the hardest choice of his life. The dynamite had been ready, the fuse cut to length. One spark and the dam would have burst, sending a wall of water roaring down the valley. It would have washed away the soldiers, Bradley's entire force, like ants in a flood. But then came the sound, a baby's cry. At first, Tobias thought he imagined it some cruel echo of Clara's voice from long ago. But no, it was real, faint but insistent, carried on the wind from the enemy camp. One of Bradley's men, perhaps a cook or launderer forced to travel with the soldiers, had brought a child into this nightmare. Naili had urged him to light the fuse. "If we hesitate, they kill us all," she warned. But Tobias couldn't do it. He'd buried his wife and daughter once. He would not send another child to the grave, not even the child of an enemy. Instead, Tobias and a small team flanked the enemy lines under cover of the storm. While Naili's group held the cabin and made as much noise as possible to draw attention, Tobias crept through the darkness toward the wagon where the crying came from. There he found a young woman no older than 20, huddled over a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes widened in terror as Tobias approached, but she made no move to run. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered. "I'm getting you out of here." "Why?" she asked, clutching the baby tighter. "Because your captain turned this fight into something it should never have been." Tobias led her away from the camp, keeping low and silent as bullets and screams echoed behind them. The Apache women with him dispatched the few guards who noticed them, their knives flashing briefly in the stormlight. By the time they returned to the cabin, the fight at the front had ended. Morrison's squad was destroyed. Colonel Whitmore and his reinforcements were closing in. And then Nayeli's team emerged from the shadows with a hostage, the colonel's own son. The standoff that followed felt like it stretched for hours. "Release my boy, and I'll grant you safe passage," Bradley had shouted. But his voice, once filled with authority, cracked with fear. Nayeli had stood firm, her blade at the young lieutenant's throat. There are no safe passages for murderers. But Tobias saw a glimmer of something different in the boy's eyes. Not arrogance, not cruelty, but confusion. "He doesn't know what his father has done," Tobias said quietly. "He's just a pawn. He carries his father's blood," Nayeli replied. "Or he carries the chance to stop this cycle." In the end, it was the boy himself who chose. He offered to testify against his father and Morrison's unit, exposing the atrocities committed against peaceful Apache villages. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't vengeance. It was justice. As federal marshals rode in at first light, drawn by reports of massacres and corruption, the truth spilled out like the rising sun over the prairie. Colonel Whitmore was led away in chains, his career in ruins. His men, those who survived, surrendered quietly once their leader fell. The Apache women were granted federal protection and reparations, though no amount of gold could return the families they had lost. Tobias declined the marshal's offer to rebuild his ranch under their protection. "This land holds too much blood now," he said. "It's time I moved on." Nayeli approached him as her people prepared to leave. "What will you do now?" she asked. Tobias looked out at the horizon, the endless expanse of the west stretching before him. "For 8 years I waited to die," he said. "Now I think I'll see what it feels like to live again." Nayeli's lips curved in a rare smile. "You saved more than our lives tonight, Caleb Whitlock. You saved yourself." As the Apache women rode north toward safety, Tobias saddled his horse and turned west, the rising sun at his back. Behind him, the ranch smoldered. Ahead lay a future he could not yet see, but for the first time in 8 years he wanted to. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with guns or knives, but with the decision to open a door, let people in, and take a stand for what's right. And on that storm-soaked night in Texas, Caleb Whitlock proved that a man could lose everything and still find redemption. Home isn't a place, Eliza had once told him. It's the lives you touch. Now Tobias finally understood what she meant. The sun was rising behind them, painting the Texas sky in muted golds and pale pinks. Caleb Whitlock tightened the cinch on his horse's saddle, his weathered hands moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. The air smelled of ash and rain. Behind him, his ranch lay in ruins, smoke still curling from the charred remains of the barn. Bullet holes punched through the cabin walls like silent accusations. He didn't turn to look again. There was nothing left there for him now. Clara Hendricks stood nearby, her baby cradled tight against her chest. The child had fallen asleep, finally exhausted from the long night of terror. Clara's eyes darted nervously to the horizon, as if she expected soldiers to burst from the tree line even now. "Denver's a long way," Tobias said, adjusting his rifle across his back. Clara nodded. "But I can't stay here. Not after what Morrison did." She didn't say more, and Tobias didn't ask. He'd seen enough during the fight to understand the weight she carried. Hours earlier, Tobias had been ready to die. The cabin had become a fortress, and his life a bargaining chip in a game he didn't want to play. Nayeli and her sister's 10 fierce Apache women had turned his home into the last stand of a people hunted to the brink. Together they had fought off Morrison's men, and when Colonel Whitmore's reinforcements arrived, they'd held their ground again. But the cost had been steep. 2 Apache women dead, the rest wounded and weary, and Tobias's ranch left in ruins. When the federal marshals arrived to arrest Bradley and his corrupt officers, it felt less like victory and more like the end of something Tobias hadn't realized. He'd been holding on to the belief that he could stay hidden from the world forever. "You don't have to come with us," Clara said, now breaking his thoughts. "You've done enough." Tobias met her gaze, seeing the exhaustion etched into her young face. A woman and her baby riding alone to Denver. "You wouldn't make it past the first outlaw camp." She swallowed hard but didn't argue. Tobias finished securing his saddle and offered her a hand up. "We'll ride slow. The little one needs rest." Clara hesitated for a moment before placing her hand in his. As their horses plodded away from the ranch, Tobias felt the weight of 8 years of isolation lifting from his shoulders. The wind carried the scent of open plains and distant rain. Somewhere out there, a new life waited. Not the one he'd planned with Eliza and Clara years ago, but a life all the same. Ahead lay miles of rough country rivers to cross, and men who might not take kindly to a rancher traveling with a young woman and her child. But Tobias felt no fear. He'd faced worse and survived. And for the first time in nearly a decade, he wasn't riding away from something. He was riding toward it. That night, as they made camp under a stand of cottonwoods, Clara asked him quietly, "Why are you helping me?" Tobias poked at the fire with a stick, the embers sparking upward. Because a long time ago someone told me kindness is the only thing that keeps us human, he said. I forgot that for a while. Last night reminded me. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Maybe you're not as broken as you think. Tobias didn't reply. He just stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. As the stars wheeled overhead, Caleb Whitlock felt something stir deep inside, a fragile ember of hope he thought had gone cold long ago. Tomorrow they would ride west again, further from the ashes of the past and closer to whatever waited beyond the horizon. And for the first time in 8 long years, Caleb Whitlock felt alive. Sometimes the hardest road is the one that leads you back to yourself. As we grow older, we learn that life is less about the battles we fought and more about the choices we made in moments of quiet courage. Caleb Whitlock's story reminds us that even after years of loss and solitude, it's never too late to open the door to others or to ourselves. His decision to shelter those in need, even at great personal risk, shows us the power of compassion to break cycles of fear and violence. In the end, it wasn't his rifle or his walls that saved him, but his willingness to stand for what was right. For those of us in our later years, the lesson is clear. Kindness isn't weakness, and our greatest legacy may come not from what we built for ourselves, but from how we helped others on their journey. Even when the world feels darker and colder than we remember, one act of mercy can light a fire that burns long after we're gone. Like Tobias, we are never too old to choose humanity over bitterness, connection over isolation, and hope over despair. Perhaps the measure of a life well lived isn't what we keep, but what we give when it matters most.